Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 19th of October 2016, and we are going to do a question and answer session again today, all things related to sound for video and film. So, first of all, there was a question last week, and I apologize, I couldn't find the original email, so I apologize, I don't remember your name, but you asked a question about ADR, how to do it. I found something this week that may be helpful for you a little bit. There's a podcast called Tone Benders, and I'll leave a link for it down below so you can go check it out. But they had a recent episode where they brought on a couple of ADR mixers, and these are guys that are working on major productions, on TV shows and films, and so they really truly understand ADR. They do it on a daily basis. Their names are Patrick Christensen and Chris Navarro, and they had some interesting insights. Now, they're not necessarily, I listened to this episode. It's about, is it an hour? Yeah, it's a little over an hour. It is an interesting episode. It doesn't get into all the nitty-gritty of the mechanics, but it is helpful, I think, to listen to what some ADR mixers have to say. So that's a resource for you that I hope you'll find helpful. All right. Going on to our next question from Sanjeev. Hi, Curtis. Thanks for your amazing work. My question, although I've seen this in a few videos, it is very hard to understand these videos. Don't explain about the decibel readings before they explain about the setting. I'm talking about how to set the ideal volume level in the external recorder like Tascam and Zoom. Can you please explain what the plus and minus readings mean, and when the meter starts jumping as we talk and while we stay quiet, and how we set up the input levels for a quiet audio, say at a beach or a park? Okay, Sanjeev, I think there's one thing I don't understand about your question entirely, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about this a little bit and hopefully recover what you're asking. If you were talking about dialogue, let me talk about dialogue first, and then I'll talk a little bit more about recording ambiance. I do mostly dialogue recordings, just so you're aware. I don't know as much about recording ambiance, but let me share with you what I do know. First of all, in terms of decibels and the meters on your recorder, it depends on the recorder as to what type of scale it uses. Now, most of the consumer devices are going to use a dB full scale to measure decibels. So 0 is the absolute highest that the digital system can handle. That's the loudest sound it can record or convert to a digital signal and record. And the quietest it can record is minus infinity. So everything in between there is what you're measuring on the meter. Normally, what I like to do is to record so that the dialogue peaks as it starts dancing up and down. I like to get the peaks at about minus 12 to minus 18, depending on the device. If it's a device with a really noisy, like a lot of noise floor, I like to get it a little closer to minus 12, just to try and beat some of that noise. That's hard to do, and it's dangerous because if your talent suddenly gets very loud, they have the possibility of hitting the 0 dB mark, in which case they will start to clip and you'll start to hear distortion. So I guess, Sanjeev, in short, the idea with recording dialogue where you have a very dynamic sound, dialogue is very dynamic, meaning it goes up and down a lot. The secret is you need to leave enough headroom so that the sound doesn't get so loud that it gets to 0 and starts to clip and distort. So what you want to do is you want to set the input level or the gain so that, again, ideally on that dynamic sound source, the peaks are hitting somewhere between minus 18 and minus 12. That way, when they get a little bit louder, there's still enough headroom to record that without distorting. So that's one of the first things to consider. Some devices use a different scale. So when I say consumer devices, I'm talking about most of the Tascam recorders. I'm talking about, I believe, all the Zoom recorders I've used, including the Zoom F8. Those are all dB full scale meters. And what I mean by dB full scale, let me just show you here. This is Wikipedia, and it gives some definitions here. If you can go to the link, actually I'll leave the link down below on this particular thing here. dB full scale, which is often abbreviated dBFS. Let's go and find that again. Here it is, right here. This is the amplitude of a signal compared with the maximum which a device can handle before clipping occurs. This is almost all digital systems are going to have meters. Not all of them, but a lot of them are going to have meters with a dB full scale. And what that means is that 0 is the loudest it can record, minus infinity is the quietest, and most everything is going to fall somewhere in between there if you set your gain up correctly. So again, for a dynamic sound source like Dialogue, you want to set that gain until the peaks are hitting either somewhere between -18 and -12. Then in post, typically what you'll do with Dialogue is you'll want to normalize that so that you get kind of the maximum, you get a reasonable loudness, I should say, depending on what your target is. That's a different conversation for another time. So that's the first thing. When you're recording sound effects or ambiance, it can be very different. A lot of ambiances in particular, like room tone, like the equivalent of room tone outdoors, whatever you would call that, just tone of an outdoor setting, where there may be a little bit of a breeze, there may be some birds chirping, there may be some leaves rustling as the wind blows through them, things of that nature. I don't know as much about that, but when I have done that in the past, you don't necessarily want to record that as hot. That is to say, you don't necessarily want to have the peaks hitting as high. I would say in that case, if it's a not terribly dynamic tone or ambiance, I'd probably aim somewhere in the -24 to -18 range. But again, there are other people that record ambiances that know more about this than me. So if one of you are out there and you have better advice, please chime in and let us know. So that's what I can tell you about that. I hope that's helpful, Sanjeev. That's a great question. And I hope that answer gives you a little bit more context, a little help. All right, we had another similar question from Marco. Curtis, hi. Please, I need to know the kinds of ways to measure sound and the difference between them, dB, sound pressure level, SPL. I need to understand this subject and the way technicians measure sound regardless country or type of work. This is somewhat related, but a little bit different. So everything I said holds true when you're metering your audio through, with an audio recorder or a mixer. I guess one thing I didn't say, we talked about consumer devices, and let me finish this one up a little bit, and then Marco, I'll come to your question. There is another scale that you will find on some of the professional mixers, including, in my case, the Sound Devices 633, and I think all of the Sound Devices, all of them, I think all of the 6 series mixers certainly, is dBu. And dBu actually is a different scale, and it refers to a voltage. So it's different than dB full scale. dB full scale is representing how all of the amplitude of different sound can be represented in a digital system. dBu actually has to do with voltage, and it's usually used on analog devices. So that's a little bit different. So for example, on my Sound Devices 633, the meter actually goes from -infinity to, I believe, +24 dB. So it's a little bit different. Again, that's referring to a voltage. So it's a completely different scale. And in that case, usually when I am setting the input level to kind of illustrate the difference, in that case, I'm usually aiming for I want my peaks to hit about 0 dB. So completely different thing there. That you'll find it on the more higher end devices and on analog devices, certainly not consumer level digital recorders. So hopefully that makes a little sense. You can go to this link over here at Wikipedia if you want to really nerd out and get very technical definitions for each of those things. Now coming back to Marco's question, I think you're mainly talking about measuring sound pressure levels, which is very different than using a meter on a recorder, because it's a more objective measure of how loud an environment is or how loud the sounds are in an environment. So in that particular case, we're talking about SPL, or sound pressure levels. That's what SPL stands for. And here we have another scale called decibels sound pressure level, or dBSPL. So this is actually another kind of a different definition of dB, and it's relative to what is considered to be the quietest sound that a human ear can hear, and it's 20 micropascals. So it's just a different scale, and from my point of view, this is kind of a more objective more objective kind of measure of sound pressure levels. And that's usually what sound pressure level meters are measuring. It's really measuring the loudness of the sound in an environment. And it's completely different than what you would find on a digital recorder. So this is a measure that should translate from one environment to another and from one measuring device to another. So that's what sound pressure levels are about. And in that case, for example, the one that always sticks in my mind as sort of a reference, and by the way, there are some apps you can get for most smartphones that will measure this. They may not be the most accurate because it depends on the microphone of your device, and they need to be calibrated technically. But just to get a sense, I would certainly recommend downloading them. The one I have on iOS, I'm not aware of which ones are on Android. I'm sure there are some on Android, but the one I use here on iOS is called SPL meter. Very simply. I use that sometimes in different environments just to get a sense for what the sound pressure levels are. And what often happens is, there we go, let's see. This will give you the opportunities to sort of measure what the sound pressure level is in a different environment. And you can sort of start to get a sense for what the different sound pressure level readings mean. So for example, here in the United States, there's an organization called OSHA, which has to do with workplace safety. They have all sorts of regulations for workplace safety. And I believe, don't quote me on this, my recollection is that a worker can work in an environment, this is one of their rules, a worker can work in an environment with a sound pressure level of 78 decibels SPL for up to 8 hours. If it's any louder than that, then it's required that the employer provide them with ear protection, something that manages that loudness or those sound pressure levels. So I would definitely recommend getting one of those apps and using them in different environments to kind of sort of get a sense for the what different sound pressure levels sound like. And over time, you'll start to develop an ear for that and be able to tell how loud an environment is. So hopefully that's helpful, and that relates to what you were asking about, and also relates to the ways we measure sound levels on recorders in terms of decibels full scale and decibels U or dBU. So, all right. Thanks for those questions. We're going to move on here. Stephen in Ottawa asks a question. Hi, Curtis. I really appreciate your work. Without a doubt, you saved me a lot of money with your thorough reviews, allowing me to make smarter buying decisions. I'm glad it's helpful, Stephen. One area I have a hard time getting my head around seems to be cabling, and I don't think I'm alone in this. Balanced, unbalanced, mic level, line level, rings and tips. I have too little knowledge to be competent, but just enough to get me into trouble. A specific example is using a Sennheiser G3 wireless system as a camera hop out of my Sound Devices 442-744 combo. I know enough that I can't use any old 1/8 inch or 3.5 millimeter cable to feed the transmitter and expect great results. Would you be able to give a 10,000 foot overview of the basics of cabling, dotted with examples of what your setup uses, what connects to what and why? Thanks very much. Let me just first pull up, there actually is a video I did on my channel a while back called Will That Microphone Work with My Camera or Recorder? Power Plugs and Connectors. That will answer part of your question, I think. We talk in this particular case about 3.5 millimeter or 1/8 inch plugs and connectors and cables. We also talk about XLR cables a little bit. We don't cover everything you're asking, but I think a pretty good overview. So first of all, balanced versus unbalanced has to do with this is a very practical definition. This is not a technical definition. Balanced cables are able to potentially reject more potential interference than unbalanced cables. For a balanced connection to work, and it can be on XLR or it can be on 3.5 millimeter or on 1/4 inch, which is the larger version of the same thing, it needs to be at least TRS. It needs to have 3 different poles on the cable or on the plug. So for example, you can see here on the TRS on the screen, there's a tip, a ring, and a sleeve. Then, so that's the minimum you need for balance. Just because you have a tip, ring, sleeve doesn't mean it's balanced. That's just the minimum that you have to send a balanced signal. My understanding with the Sennheiser G3 is it's not balanced. It is an unbalanced signal. Someone correct me on that if I'm wrong, but my understanding is it's not balanced. Pretty sure. So So in that case, using TRS isn't getting you a balanced connection necessarily, but what it can potentially do is when you're wearing headphones on the headphone jack on the well, does a G3? So you're going into the microphone input of the transmitter, and you have the receiver on the camera to do a camera hop. And I believe that microphone input is not balanced. I believe it's unbalanced. So you're taking an unbalanced cable out of your Sound Devices 6 or 744 recorder, sending that to the G3 on an unbalanced input, microphone input, and that's going on the hop. And I believe it's unbalanced from the receiver to the camera as well. So anyway, I think this video will be helpful for you. It doesn't cover all of it, but it covers some of it. Also, there are TRS, which is tip ring sleeve. This is typically used for mobile devices where you have both a stereo headphone and a microphone all on a single connector. And that's how you get the ability to do that, to have that kind of headset for your mobile phone. TS is a tip sleeve. That's going to be an unbalanced connection always. And usually that's a mono microphone input. Okay, so those are some things. Let's see. Let me just make sure I'm helping a little bit here. Okay, then there's mic level versus line level. Mic level versus line level has to do with the strength of the signal that's being sent in an analog signal that's being sent from one device to another. Mic level is much weaker. Line level is a much stronger, and they have to do with voltages. So a line level is a certain voltage or voltage range at least. Line level signal is usually after all the amplification after the preamplification has taken place. If you have not already taken my production sound course, we do talk about it in more depth there, if that's of interest to you. But the main idea is that the sound comes into your microphone. It does the first stage of amplification and gets the signal up to a mic level signal. That then goes into your preamplifier, such as in your Sound Devices, mixer and or recorder. And at that point in the preamplifier, it's raised from a microphone level signal to a line level signal, which is a much stronger voltage, again, an analog voltage. Then from there, it's usually sent to, for example, your Sound Devices 744, it's then sent to an analog to digital converter, and it's converted to digital from there. And then it's recorded off to a card or a drive or whatever you happen to have in that particular recorder. So I think in your particular case with the Sennheiser G3, if you're sending a hop to a camera from your Sound Devices 744, that you're going to generally use a TRS cable, 3.5 millimeter cable, or what you call a 1/8 inch cable, same thing. And that will get the signal, an unbalanced signal, out of the Sound Devices into the G3 transmitter via a mic level input. And that's why you probably have to pull that level way down when you're using a G3, because that G3, I don't know if it can, actually the G3 can probably take a line level input as well. I'm not positive on that. So if there's some settings, anyway, I'm probably making this more confusing than helpful at this point, but those are the main differences between balanced and unbalanced, mic level versus line level, and rings and tips, the TS, TRS, and TRRS. So go ahead and check out this video here. That'll help a little bit. And I'm going to stop here before I confuse the matter more. Thank you, Stephen, for the question. All right. One more question, and then we have a tip after this one. This is, I believe you say Uva. I hope I didn't mispronounce that. But he says, "Hi, Curtis. Thanks for the offer to cover some of my questions. Here's one thing in particular I'd like to get your opinion on. What should one consider while capturing audio in extreme conditions, such as documentary filmmaking, while mountaineering, or in marine environments? I would imagine that aspects like heat and cold, robustness of the audio equipment, and power are some of the more important points to look out for." I completely agree. Maybe you can tell us some more about the peculiarities of such situations, perhaps also providing insight into storing and protecting the equipment. Yes, I will say, first of all, I haven't done a lot of recording in super extreme environments. I have done some in freezing temperatures, but pretty short. It wasn't a whole lot. But these are the things I can tell you. As far as mountaineering and extreme temperatures, I actually live in a place where 6,000 feet altitude at my home, and there's mountains here that climb up to as high as almost 11,000 feet. So we are, and the winters get pretty cold here, as you might imagine. So first of all, cold environments. The number one thing in my experience that you need to do in cold environments is that you need to keep your batteries warm. And there are a variety of ways you can do that. One thing that I have done is mainly for skiers and people that are working outdoor, they have these little packs you can buy. They're disposable packs that you can buy that provide chemical warmth. So you essentially take them out of the package and you kind of wrinkle them up a little bit, and then they will provide several hours of warmth. And typically people stick them in their gloves when they're skiing and things of that nature. I imagine as a mountain, if you've done some mountaineering, which it sounds like perhaps you have in Austria, you've probably seen those before. That's one thing you can put in your sound bag down by the batteries, which can help a little bit to keep those batteries warm. That's the reason that's important, is that when batteries get cold, they lose their power very, very quickly. So that's one thing I've done for short periods of time. I'm not sure what to do if you're going to be going on a serious multi-day expedition. I would think that one thing you're going to want to do is seriously insulate those batteries until you get them out for use. And then in those cases, you're going to want to have some sort of heating solution. Again, those little packs for warming your hands and feet may not be enough, or you're going to need a whole lot of those. They don't get super hot, but they help a little bit. So there's one thought about cold. In terms of heat, it's a similar situation. If things get too hot, you never want to leave your recorder and your batteries in a sealed car in the heat. Cars can easily get to very, very hot temperatures, in which case the electronics of your recorder and the batteries can be damaged. So if you're going to be out somewhere hot and it comes to a place where you have to, lock up the car, and maybe even if you're traveling and you're going into a restaurant to get something to eat or whatever it may be, I would highly recommend you take your most sensitive equipment with you. So you're probably definitely going to want to take your mixer, your batteries, and your microphones with you. So you don't want to leave them in that hot car sealed up, even for a relatively short period of time, because they can heat up really fast and you can do damage. So that's one thought there. Often when you're out, and just kind of a general thought here, when you're doing sound on a serious production, get over how you look. Just doesn't matter how you look. You need to be comfortable, so you need to dress comfortably for that situation, whatever that involves. Cold is tricky, because in cold, we often are going to need to wear heavy jackets, and a lot of heavy jackets make a lot of noise. So when you're moving your jacket around, my down-filled jacket, I notice, as my arms move, if there's any movement, that can generate some sound, and so you're going to have to be kind of careful about that as well. So you'll want to test, what outerwear you're going to be wearing in cold conditions. Heat conditions, it's not as big of a deal, because you're going to be wearing just a shirt, probably some shorts, and that's not going to necessarily be a sound issue. But there's another consideration as well. So be careful and carefully choose what outerwear you're going to be wearing in particular, so that if you are booming, for example, that you're not generating a bunch of noise. This is another case where robust equipment makes a big deal as well. There's a big difference as well. Working in very hot or very cold environments, usually the professional gear is going to be a little bit more robust. For example, I don't even know if Sound Devices has specifications, but I think they usually do. Sounddevices.com. Let's just take a look here. And let's take a look at, for example, the 633. We're going to look at the specifications. Do they have anything related? Environmental. So here, for example, the operating specifications are minus 20 degrees Celsius to 60 degrees Celsius, and they also have a humidity rating here, 0 to 90% relative humidity, to avoid condensation, which can create problems, especially for microphones. That's actually going to be a bigger issue for microphones than it is for most recorders, in my experience. Some microphones are very sensitive to that. I think the Schoeps microphones in particular, more the CMC, the Colette series, have a reputation for having trouble when it gets really, really humid. So that's something you're also going to want to check too. If you are going to be recording in a humid environment, marine would be one, for example. You're going to want to test your microphone and all of your equipment, in fact, beforehand. Don't just plan on showing up to do a gig and not having tested your equipment in a humid environment prior to that, because you could run into serious issues where you're not going to be able to record. Some other things too in terms of storage. If you're going from one environment, and this happens a lot of times if you're in a like a tropical area, you have the equipment indoors in an air-conditioned area, then you go outdoors. That's where the condensation tends to take place. One thing you can do that can help that is, particularly like your microphones, you can put them in a Ziploc bag or some sort of bag that seals. You can take them outdoors and let them sit for about 30 minutes. If you're going to have to plan ahead for that. And that a lot of times what will happen is the condensation will build up on the bag first as the temperature of the microphone and the mixer, kind of changes from the air-conditioned environment to the outdoor environment. And then once you've gotten past a lot of that condensation, then you can take the gear out and you tend to have fewer problems. That also applies to camera gear, lenses, and things of that nature. So that's something to consider as well. What else can I tell you about those topics? Power, we talked about with batteries. That's very important in cool places. Cold places. In warm places, I haven't run into that issue as much, as long as you're not, again, you don't want to store your mixer in a place that's going to be, more than 60 degrees Celsius or, 140 degrees, which is, and again, a car that's closed up can easily get to that temperature and higher. So those are just some of my thoughts. I hope those are helpful for you. Again, I don't have a lot of experience working in extreme conditions with the sound, but those are some things that hopefully are helpful. One last thing is actually a tip, not so much a question, and this was an interesting one from Nick Losnick. Said something interesting, and I think kind of the theme here is do as many things as you can to be prepared so that you don't make mistakes, or you prevent yourself from making mistakes when you're in the thick of a production and you have to work quickly. He said this: "Hey Curtis, thanks for answering my previous questions. I picked up this tip on a wedding videographer's forum and I thought I'd share it with you and your listeners. The situation is this: you're on a shoot, frantically racing the clock to get set up. You, an assistant, or the talent accidentally plugs the 3.5 millimeter lavalier microphone into the headphone jack on your digital recorder. This has happened to me with a Tascam DR05. Obviously, the mic jack was not recorded. The solution is to either tape over the headphone jack, good advice, or use one of these little plastic dust plugs, and he leaves a link for that, and I'll put that down below for here. He picked up about 20 of these on Amazon for $4, so it's a very inexpensive solution. That's a great idea. Now, not only does this apply to things like a Tascam DR05 or a Zoom H1, one of the things that we'll be reviewing in the next couple months here is a new device by Tascam called the DR10L, and it's a distributed audio recorder, very much like the Juice Link Little Darling. So what it does is it's like a wireless transmitter body pack, except it's a recorder instead. It doesn't transmit anything wirelessly. It actually does the recording on the body pack. And it has both a microphone input and a headphone output. And you have to be very careful to make sure you get it in the right one. So great little tip. Thanks for that, Nick. I appreciate that. All right, that's everything we had for this week. I hope that was helpful for you. Thanks for everyone sending in their questions. Again, really impressed with the questions you're asking. They're very thoughtful and clearly demonstrate that you're out there trying to make better audio. So keep that up, and we'll talk to you again next week.